Welcome, everybody. Good morning. This is Friday Cafe, May 21st, and thank you so much for joining us. We know this is an incredibly busy time, and we really appreciate you being here. And we're very pleased to bring this topic to you today, the journey from equity talk to equity action, with some fabulous presenters I know that you're really going to enjoy. And we have a number of resources for you to follow up from today's meeting. So I'm Judy Carson with the State Department of Education, where my work is school, family, community partnerships. And I'm joined by my colleague and partner, Betsy Laborious, who's the director of Connecticut's statewide family engagement center called Connecticut Family School Partnership, housed at CREC. And Betsy's colleague, Francisco Bares, is behind the scenes doing the magic that's helping us be here today. We're also joined by our partner, colleague, and friend, Ann Henderson, who's a national consultant on family engagement. We're very pleased that she's part of Connecticut's team. Next slide, please. So for those who have been here before, you know our operating instructions. We have goals to bring you new information that expands our thinking. We're here to build our connections and put family engagement on the map, and the people who do the work are very valued. I think through this historic time, that's become extremely clear. And then our operating instructions are our values. And these are some of the very same values we know that you have in your work with families in your schools, districts, and programs. So this is the network for us to be together. And for anyone who's new, welcome. We're very glad to have you. You've joined a fantastic tribe. Next slide, please. So I have a few announcements. There's a lot going on, as you know. There's a few things that are really relevant for our community. And as I go through these, there's links. And what I'm going to do in just a few minutes, I'm going to put this slide with the links in the chat box so that you can access it right away. So first, there's a webinar coming up next week, May 27th, on home visiting. There's a lot of home visiting that we're doing, especially during the summer, to help re-engage students and families. And this session is going to talk about best practices. We're going to feature some of those practices from the parent-teacher home visiting model. And we will have national experts and also in-state experts who are using this model. So do join us May 27th. Also, big announcement, you all are the first to hear. You are on the inside with this information that the Parent Trust Fund RFP is opening today. And it's going to be posted at that link very soon on the State Department of Ed website. I will also send this out through Friday Cafe. But this is state funding for parent leadership programs. So if you have ever wanted to do Parent Leadership Training Institute or People Empowering People or Parents Seeking Educational Excellence, we have funding for you. And we're very pleased that we are joined with the Office of Early Childhood, and we have more funding anticipated. Of course, we have to wait for the state budget to finalize and the legislature to finalize what they're doing. But we believe we're going to have more funding than we have in past years. So do take a look at that. There's a bidders conference that you'll want to take note of. Also on the right-hand side, I've sent these out on Friday Cafe. You've probably seen this information before. Please share with your families that there's resources for broadband access. Families can get access to high quality internet for as little as $50 a month. And it's a very generous qualifying application there. And then enrollment is open now for Access Health Connecticut. So families can have health insurance. Please take a look at that. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Betsy Laborious. And she's going to introduce the rest of the morning. And I just want to say, again, thank you for being here. Take it away, Betsy.
Hey, thank you. So happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to Friday Cafe. Judy didn't say, but this is our 7th year implementing Friday Cafe. And I have to tell you that we keep growing, and that's because of your support and networking as far as each one bringing one in terms of our Friday Cafe. As you know, this is really about not only what we take away for ourselves, but it's also mental health for all of the professionals who are working in the field of family engagement. And that represents a whole lot of different disciplines. I know that you are incredibly busy. We're hearing a whole lot about what you're doing. We're talking to people about, we're listening to what you have to say. So again, I want to just express my complete recognition and validation for the work that you're doing. So what I'd like to do now is we have our conversation catalyst, as you know. Top on the priority, not only for the statewide Family Engagement Center and our partnership work that we're doing in Connecticut, is equity and inclusion. And we've made that a major focus and also a goal of the work that we are doing. And toward that end, we found some fabulous people to be with us here today to talk about that initiative. And so I'm going to just introduce both Danielle and Joanna, doctors, Geller. Joanna, it's Danielle Perry and Joanna Geller, and they are from the NYU Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and Transformation of Schools. They've done a lot of research and have a lot of information for us to not only share with each other, but also to talk about as we're beginning to think about equity and what that means in our schools, and how we can kind of take our thoughts and our discussions and plant those seeds in terms of what's going on in Connecticut. I don't know if anybody I watch Morning Joe in the morning prior to coming to work. And this morning, our Secretary of State, Dr. Cardona, was on, and he had a lot to say about, again, the equity gaps in terms of as we move forward and as we schools. So it's a timely topic, and again, I welcome your participation and great discussion. So Danielle and Joanna, I'm going to turn it over to you right now.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Joanna and I are really excited to share with you our presentation on centering family and community on the journey from equity talk to equity action. So Joanna and I are both at the NYU Metro Center, and we center our work around educational equity, racial and social justice. And today we are going to center our conversation around family engagement and equity. We are focusing on 5 key points, but before we get there, I want to begin by acknowledging the critical need for conversations on equity and action right now. This past year has been extremely difficult, especially for many communities of color. And I want to thank all of you for being here to engage in this conversation despite any personal traumas that you may be experiencing. As Joanna and I are presenting, please feel free to share your ideas, your thoughts, and your reflections in the chat box. We welcome and are open to this dialogue. So the 5 key points that will guide our conversation today include beginning by discussing why educational equity must be rooted in culturally responsive and sustaining practices, and we'll define what that means and what it looks like. Next, we'll move to the need for families to be a part of equity initiatives. Families are the center and should be the center of this work, and we'll talk about why. We'll discuss how equity talk and equity action must be a reinforcing cycle, and that there must be action attached to conversations about equity. We will talk about how relationships are fundamental to this process, particularly that authentic relationship that needs to be developed between families and schools. And we'll close our presentation by talking about some practical steps together. So on the next slide, we have a equity table. And in this table, you'll see some typical traps and tropes that sometimes come up in the process of equity work. So we want to begin this work together by taking a few minutes to think about the traps and tropes that are presented in the table. And as you are processing and reading this table, we want you to ponder on these two questions. The first one being, from your perspective, how do you see and what do you understand educational equity to be? And does it fall into any of these traps and tropes? So the questions are displayed on the presentation slide, and all the traps and tropes that Joanna and I have identified are in the table to the left of it. So think about how and why you format ideas about equity while processing these two questions. So at the NYU Metro Center, we understand educational equity as each student receiving the resources and supports that they need in order to be successful in school and beyond. So when in the process of equity being achieved, understanding that equity is a process that is not a one-off thing, we see that there are some key features that need to be included. So when we're thinking about doing this doing equity, achieving equity in an authentic way, we're thinking about ensuring high expectations and outcomes for all participants in the educational system. One of my colleagues likes to frame this as a reach to each rather than a reach to all. Disrupting inequitable practices, examining biases, and creating environments of belonging for students, teachers, and families. So this gets to that idea of we're not just crafting curriculum and pouring money into other things. We need to look at the whole system, the whole student. And we're cultivating the unique gifts, talents, and interests that each person possesses. So what is each student, what is each teacher, what is each family member bringing into the learning experience, and how can that enrich the learning of others? So in order for there to be equity, education must be culturally responsive and sustaining. Equity as a process needs to understand that students will see themselves reflected in the classroom and that they will have strong, authentic relationships with their teachers. So when culturally responsive and sustaining education as a practice includes what we see as 4 key components. The first component is centering and valuing students' cultures and identities. So who are your students when they are outside of the room? And how does that influence all the pieces of themselves that they bring into the classroom, that they're bringing into their schooling environments? How does this influence how teachers are able to interact and engage with families? 2, using rigorous and relevant curriculum and anti-oppressive teaching practices. So are the teaching practices that are being employed in the classroom, is it aligned with students' cultural identities? And understanding that that is important. Building strong positive relationships between students and families. So again, you cannot achieve points number 3 without first acknowledging points number 1 and 2, understanding that this is a process that builds upon each other. And 2, supporting students to develop the knowledge, skills, and vision to transform the world to liberation. So understanding all the assets and possibilities that come with students' unique identities, cultures, and how that is influencing their processes of learning. So Joanna and I often present the key role of authentic relationships in family engagement work. And these authentic relationships cannot be developed without first acknowledging and honoring each student and their family, which begins with being culturally responsive and sustaining. And we see culturally responsive and sustaining as a key component in schools because when students, for one, students deserve access to a quality public education that honors their cultures, their backgrounds, and their communities. And education should connect students' academic learning to their lives, to their passions, and to their struggles that are taking place inside and outside of school. Particularly during these times. Over the last year, we've seen a rise in this of racism and harsh discipline policies that are impacting students' learning. Public schools themselves are full of inequities that impact students' everyday lives, and we need culturally responsive and sustaining education in order to transform schooling. Without this radical transformation and reimagining of education, schools will continue to fail to meet the academic, social, and emotional needs of historically marginalized students and their families. However, we know that equity cannot be achieved in a silo. As we saw on the slide with the traps and tropes, it needs key stakeholders from all groups to be involved. And this is especially true for the involvement and the engagement of families. So it is important to include families in this process because families have these particular strengths, resources, and knowledge that they're able to offer to schools. And these knowledges, these experiences stem from their own lived experiences, from the things that they encounter in their day-to-day lives, the ways that they've developed maneuvering techniques to prepare their children for their educative spaces. And the knowledge that these families can bring to the schools can help inform school leaders, teachers, and other schooling staff what the specific needs of their students and families are, but not just needs, also what the assets and possibilities are for student learning. And it also gives schools key insights on what culturally responsive and sustaining practices could and should look like inside of schools. And a key example of this is Yoso's theory on community cultural wealth. And this theory helps provide some framing to understand how culturally responsive and sustaining practices and family engagement go hand in hand. So Yoso's theory on community cultural wealth is rooted in critical race theory, and it helps shift our lens away from a deficit view of families. So instead of looking at families as a place full of cultural poverty and disadvantages, it instead focuses on the ways that we can learn from families. What are their cultural knowledges? What are their skills? What are their abilities? And what type of context and knowledge do they possess that can help socially marginalized groups navigate certain spaces? And these are the knowledges, the values, and the tools that are often ignored, unrecognized, and unacknowledged in schooling spaces. So in order for us to reimagine schools in a culturally responsive and sustaining way, our approach to education needs to develop and acknowledge all the multiple strengths of historically marginalized families and understand the greater purpose that this can serve towards achieving educational equity and justice. So just to break this down a little bit further, I want to just explain the key pieces of Yoso's theory on community cultural wealth. So first we have aspirational capital, and this refers to the ability to maintain hopes and dreams for the future. So even when students are facing like real and perceived barriers, they're able to maintain a hope that they will be able to overcome this barrier. And this could be something as simple as taking a test that they don't necessarily feel prepared for, knowing that there are resources and supports around them that will help guide them. Linguistic capital includes the intellectual and social skills that are often attained through communication experiences. And this is usually in more than one language. So we see a lot of times in schools, especially around students who may be emergent bilingual speakers or English language learners, they're navigating multiple worlds, speaking multiple languages. And each of this influences their education experience. And we need to start thinking about this as a benefit and an asset to students' learning rather than seeing multilingual learners, being a multilingual learner as a deficit. Familial capital refers to the cultural knowledges that can be nurtured amongst students and their families. And this familial capital carries a sense of community history, memory, and cultural intuition. So again, this is the ways that families are preparing their children to be in spaces and to use that community history in navigating spaces. Social capital is understood as the networks of people and the community resources that can help provide emotional support in navigating through different social structures. Navigational capital is the skills that individuals are learning through their social networks on how to navigate these spaces. And this is critically important for individuals and students and families, social networks who are teaching families and students how to navigate spaces that are traditionally exclusionary. So an example of this would be a school that has a traditional family engagement model that isn't necessarily open and a welcome space to families, particularly families of color. And that navigational capital will be the tools and resources that family members have learned from their community in order to navigate that space. And resistant capital refers to the knowledges and skills that are opposed through, that are fostered and learned through oppositional behavior that often creates challenges and inequities.
Okay, so I'm going to pick it up from here. So just to sort of summarize all of these reasons why it's so important for families to be part of equity initiatives. And let me just say, you know, I have a feeling from who everybody is here that I don't need to be selling family engagement to you. You're here because you think it's important and you believe in it. But like me, I imagine that you're also in a place of having to sell it to others a lot. And so I always think it's helpful to just kind of have a list of reasons why it's so important. And this is an initial list, and I'm sure you have many other reasons. But the first and foremost is that families care about their kids with a sense of urgency. So parents don't want to wait another 5 or 10 years for reform to take shape. They want education to be better for their children immediately. So they bring that urgency to the conversation, which is so important. A colleague of mine who is a wonderful parent leader and parent advocate in Colorado, Arlene Forlenza, I think put it beautifully when she said that families are the horizontal thread across vertical systems. And if we think about the past year and the whole conversation, the many conversations around school reopening, you know, we think about having education folks talking about learning loss. Or learning gained from remote schooling. We had public health folks talking about whether it's safe for students to be in schools. We have people who work on economic issues talking about you know, women leaving the workplace as a result of schools closing. And so oftentimes all of these systems are so siloed and people aren't talking to each other. And this is where families are so important because families experience all of these systems at the same time. And they're in this unique position to be able to break down those silos. Additionally, families understand the issue. So problem definition is more accurate and solutions are often more relevant to the actual strengths and needs of students. One example of this that has really resonated for me is a number of years ago, my team was contracted to work for a city conducting focus groups with families of color. And the city was trying to understand how families of color could become more aware of the quality rating system that had been developed for pre-K. So they thought if parents understand what high quality pre-K looks like, then they'll be much more likely to enroll their children in high quality pre-K, which we know is good for later learning. What we learned in doing focus groups was that the families were already aware of this rating system and these standards, but they felt that it didn't, the standards that the city had come up with didn't align with what they wanted from their child's pre-K experience. So they wanted teachers who looked like their children. They wanted teachers who spoke the languages that their children spoke, who understood their culture, who could instill pride into children from a very young age and get their education started with that sense of pride. And so, you know, this example always just makes me think about how important it is to have families at the table from the very beginning and even defining what the problem is. Community members are more likely to buy into and take ownership of the change, especially in light of inevitable resistance when they're involved from the beginning. So I'm sure many of you doing equity work face resistance every single day. This is really hard work. We see it now. We see how 4 states have banned talking about critical race theory in schools recently. This isn't easy, but when community members are involved from the beginning, it's easier. It's easier when folks have your back. Changes are more likely to be sustainable when there's a demand for it, when families are bought in from the beginning. And then lastly, increased civic participation and social capital, or in other words, the trust that community members have in each other and the belief that they can make a difference. Those are really important outcomes in of themselves. So, we know that social capital is associated with better schools, with safer neighborhoods. There was a recent study that actually showed, looking across counties in the entire country, that counties with higher levels of social capital had better COVID-19 outcomes. So, developing families' sense of belonging, sense of leadership, these are really important outcomes for a healthy democracy in of themselves, aside from all of these other important reasons that I just talked about. So that brings me to the next point, which is that equity talk and equity action must be a reinforcing cycle. So I kind of hear this tension a lot of like, well, where do we start? Do we start with like changing mindsets and unlearning everything that we always thought about equity? And can we not really do anything until we change mindsets? Or do we start with action in the hope that changing behaviors will ultimately change mindsets? And so I think this idea that both are really important in balance with each other and in conversation with each other is really helpful. And this article that's linked to on this slide and is in the PDF that Judy shared in the chat, I thought was really illuminating. It's by Dr. Jal Mehta at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And in the article, he wrote, change comes when actions and beliefs move in a reinforcing cycle. In this view, changes in actions lead to changes in belief, which stimulates demand for further change. And goes on to say, so it's not that talk, reflection, reading, and learning are unimportant. To the contrary, they're critical. But this learning will be much more constructive and much more likely to be sustained if it is interwoven with actions that lead to change. At the moment, the balance is off. Too much of our current equity work is heavy on talk and short on action. We need to complete the cycle. And so Dr. Mehta then goes on to suggest 3 critical questions to ask for the group to ask themselves at the end of any conversation that will help toward moving to action. So what are the action steps that follow from our discussion? Can we co-design with students, families, and community members? And what can we try even on a small scale to see whether our hunches about what may make a difference are right? And then, of course, it's so important to go back to the reflection phase and not just do individual reflection, but also reflection on the whole process. And so some of the questions that I personally like to ask myself are, how did I show up in this space? Did I come into the conversation with an open mind to listen, to hear, rather than to respond? Recognizing that this work is hard and can bring up a lot of emotions, thinking about what emotions did I bring to the conversation? Were there times that I felt threatened or scared or frustrated or angry? And how did those feelings impact either your relationships with families or how you showed up in the space? Oftentimes in equity work, we unfortunately reproduce a lot of the same patterns that we're trying to disrupt. And so I think really reflecting on who spoke in this space, who didn't speak, and are there patterns by race, language, educational level, ability. You might think about gender in there as well. And finally, how can we do better next time? So this takes me to the 4th point, which is, we know that families are so important in equity work. We know that equity talk and equity action need to be a reinforcing cycle. but none of this can happen without relationships. Relationships between school staff and families, and relationships among families are so critical in this work. So starting with relationship building between schools and families, we know from a lot of research that relational trust between school staff and families is a key driver of school success. Really rigorous research from Chicago has shown that it's associated with a 10-fold increase in math scores and a 4-fold increase in ELA scores. For me personally, earlier this week, I had a parent-teacher conference for my 4-year-old son. And, you know, it was like a little bit, this is only my second parent-teacher conference ever, and I just didn't know what to expect. I haven't actually met the teacher face-to-face because of COVID. I hadn't been in the school all year because of COVID. So it was just hard to know what to expect. And we sat down and she had a big smile through her mask, and she just said, you know, your son is doing beautifully, and you're wonderful parents. And then she went on to tell me things, you know, that he can improve at and ways that we can work with him at home. He's not so great at focusing, you know, but just kind of getting those messages after she had all just started the conversation, telling me that he was doing beautifully, just made me trust that she cares about him and she loves him. And in turn, I will do anything to support the teachers who care about my child this much. So relational trust really matters. A few sort of strategies for developing relational trust. And again, I'm sure this group of family coordinators and folks who work with families have many, many more ideas that we look forward to hearing about in the discussion. But I think one of the most important strategies is to begin the year with deep listening. You'll hear about this a lot more when you hear from the Parent Teacher Home Visit Project, which is exciting that you'll be hearing about that. But just starting the year by asking families to describe their child's strengths, ask what are favorite activities to do as a family, what's the best way to communicate, what else should I know about your family. Other small tips are learning how to say hello in the languages of your families. I know sometimes like I'm afraid to kind of mess up the pronunciation a little bit, but just showing parents that you're willing to learn even hello in their language just shows so much respect. And then there's a rule of 5 positive communications for every negative one, whether this comes through texts or emails or little notes home, or phone calls, just making sure that negative communications are really couched in positive ones. And then I think a lot less often talked about is the importance of relationship building among families. So this is where a lot of my research lies, and a lot of the research I've been fortunate enough to do alongside Ann Henderson, with Ann really as my mentor. And we know from a lot of research that collective action among families can lead to systemic changes in school systems. So whether this is the end of punitive discipline policies and the implementation of restorative justice programs, whether this means increased funding for schools, school systems, bringing recess back after it was eliminated. There's so many examples of the ways that when families come together and act collectively, they have the power to transform the school system in a meaningful way. And what we often see when families have a chance to come together is they shift from this idea of I only care about my own child to I care about all children. And this makes it so much easier for schools and districts to actually work with families, because schools and districts are charged with caring about all children, not just one child. And so when families align their vision in that way too, the partnership can become much stronger. We also know, and this is really important right now, especially with all the mental health challenges for kids and adults that have arisen over the course of the pandemic and over the course of all the racial trauma that's happened over the past year, is that relationships between families can contribute to well-being and healing as well. When parents share their stories with each other and share that they're not alone and feel that they have the power to do something, this really helps families heal. And so I, for several years, alongside Ann Henderson, led a research project where we worked with 7 parent leadership organizations across the country. One of them was actually the Parent Leadership Training Institute, which I know has its deep roots in the state of Connecticut. We together did a participatory evaluation project where each of these organizations interviewed their families and basically asked them, what's the impact of our organization, of our work on you personally, and why? Like, what's the secret sauce behind that impact? And we found that there were 5 practices that led to impact. So first, these organizations were humanizing. They met parents' individual needs and goals. They helped parents advance their careers, advance their education, set financial goals, set goals for their families. They were familial, so they built a supportive community that felt like a family. And this was, I think, the very most important part of it, this sense of group identity and trust and belonging that these organizations set. They were unifying, so they allowed families to bring their own cultures and languages and customs into the space, but they were very intentional about also developing solidarity across difference. Empowering in that they gave families the tools and the knowledge to understand school systems and how to navigate them. And finally, responsible. So they, didn't just end after the end of the program and say goodbye, have a nice life, good luck, but really provided ongoing support to families. And so this is the final point, and then we have one more slide for now, then we'll go into our breakout groups and then come back and share a few additional resources. But the final point is to start where you are, but don't stay there. And so I think that this spectrum of community engagement to ownership that the Movement Strategy Center created is really helpful way of thinking about how the process from community engagement to ownership is developmental, and it can't all happen at once. And so this spectrum shows the stance towards community from ignoring them to informing, consulting, involving, collaborating, and finally deferring to the community. And, I think where I often see schools and districts that are really trying to, care about engaging families and really trying to do this work is in the consulting phase. So, doing surveys of families, doing focus groups, getting their input on decisions that have, started to be made. Why this isn't necessarily community engagement in its true form is because a community hasn't necessarily been developed among these families. So, families are giving their individual response, their individual opinion. They haven't had the opportunity to build that community with other families and develop a collective voice, a shared analysis of the problem, and a shared vision for the solution. And so these later stages of involving, collaborating, and ultimately deferring to is when families are really coming together to build this collective power. And so I think that's why it's so important to sort of be honest about where you are now and think about how can we move on to higher levels of community ownership. So that's what we got for you for now. We're really excited to hear what you all have to say in the breakout session. So I'll turn it back over to Danielle to introduce those.
Thank you, Joanna. So we'll spend about 20 minutes discussing these discussion questions. This will allow for us to engage in some deep conversations with each other in a small group setting. So these questions displayed on the screen are, is there a time where you, your school, or your program moved from equity talk to equity action? What did this process look like for you? How did you engage families in the process, and what did you learn? So if your answer to this question is yes, there has been a time, then you can answer the subsequent questions based on your experience. If there wasn't a time where you've moved from equity talk yet to equity action in your practice, that's completely okay. Then you can use this time to do some reimagining and some freedom dreaming about what you would like your equity action to look like. So we're going to break into some small discussion groups, and each of Joanna and I will facilitate one group, and then we'll have some other leaders from the Kentucky State Department of Education facilitating some groups as well. And I think that process is already set up. If anyone feels like they want to unmute themselves and just share like one key takeaway they learned, we would love that. And if you don't feel comfortable unmuting yourself and speaking out loud, you can feel free to utilize the chat box, but we would love to hear your voices for about 5 minutes or so on some key takeaways.
Danielle, hi, I'm Mary Lou. I work with Betsy. I moderated the group and I got nominated to report out. So it was a very interesting group. But the one thing that really I think stood out, the different districts are involved, but someone brought up that when you are speaking with parents or meeting with parents in any kind of group, to prepare and to make sure that there's a translator who can make that person, those parents, feel comfortable using their native language and with someone who's has an understanding of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
That will make the process go much more smoothly, and it makes the parents and families feel much more relaxed.
Exactly. And I think that ties a lot into what we were discussing in my group, as well as creating educative spaces as of sites of sustaining and being sustaining of individuals' ways of being, making sure that places are supporting students and families feeling like they belong in that space, that's an authentic space that they belong in, and not that they're being invited into that space as an outsider and made to feel like they're an outsider. So having supports in places for families to feel like they belong in that space, that they're welcome and supported in that space is very important. So thank you for sharing.
In group 5, we had an interesting discussion about restorative justice and the changes that has created. At the school board in Waterbury decided to have restorative justice practices introduced into the schools. And people from the State Department of Education and maybe someplace else came in and did workshops for both the staff and the community so everybody would understand what it was. And that created sort of a different culture in the school and the community where people felt like they could actually raise issues and talk about them. And so that has led to a lot more discussion in the high school where she works, where there are many more cultural resources available and students feel comfortable sharing about their cultures and learning about other students' cultures.
It seems like a great model to look at in terms of getting families and staff on the same page about restorative practice.
Right, or that could happen with home visits or any other important new innovation that we want to introduce into schools or the system to make sure that everybody understands what it is and is on board and feels free to share their ideas about it and be part of it, which gets back to what Danielle was saying about creating that sense of belonging and not being an outsider, but everybody is on board and on the team to make this new thing work.
Right. And an opportunity for some dual capacity learning there for both educators and families to be engaged in the process together.
I'm just gonna jump right in. One of the things that came out of group 3 is we want to congratulate Danielle and Joanna because they said what a powerful and fabulous presentation this was. And for myself, I'm writing furiously all the stuff that you put down as far as my notes, because I've been doing this work for 20 years and I have all new thinking. My brain is on fire. So I want to thank you. I want to thank group 3 because they did some amazing things in talking about policy changes in Stratford and that implementation of all kids having access to high-level classes, and I thought that was an incredible kind of action on behalf of a system.
Okay, so Danielle and I just wanted to leave you with a few different approaches for having conversations that engage families, communities, educators, all in one space. And the first approach that we really like a lot is this approach called appreciative inquiry. And this starts with really trying to understand what the strengths are in a community, with the philosophy that if you lead with the strengths, it gets people energized and excited about making change rather than leading with the challenges, which can just make people feel really heavy and bogged down. And so there's a whole guide for appreciative inquiry. It's very flexible. It can be adapted to a local context, but the crux of it is getting folks together and having them, in this case, families, reflect on a time when they felt really connected to their child's school or education, and asking them, what did this feel like? What was memorable about it? And if you had 3 wishes that would ensure a more successful experience, like the one you just described, what would they be? And what's really neat about this approach is that families can actually interview each other with these questions and then report out. So it can be really highly engaging. And it goes through a process of like dreaming about what might be, to designing and implementing. And so this is one way to kind of start these types of conversations. And Danielle and I are just going to pinball back and forth.
So the NYU Metro Center developed an equity continuum, and you see a little illustration of that on the slide here. Essentially, it's a tool for families, community members, and district staff, including teachers and school leaders, to begin conversations and outline steps on moving towards becoming more equitable. So districts can use the equity-centered school reform continuum to better understand what stages of engagement they have with families, and this ranges from not yet begun to exemplary. And when you are using the continuum, you'll move between stages by highlighting the different practices and behaviors that are currently being employed in schools. When engaging in this process, we imagine all of these key stakeholders together having deep conversations where they are reimagining what equity can look like in their schools and in their communities, and then subsequently developing an action plan to reach that level of exemplary family engagement.
And then the next resource, and unfortunately this is not online, but maybe it can just be emailed as a PDF afterwards, is this Family Leadership District Self-Assessment Tool. And so this is the graphic that goes along with it, but there's a rubric that educators and family members can fill out together about sort of how ready is their district for family leadership and how welcoming is the district to engage families as leaders. And it builds off of the dual capacity building framework. So you can see on one side, we have parent capacity building to be leaders and developing a sense of community among parents. And then on the other side, we have educator capacity building and educator family collaboration, all with a strong infrastructure for family engagement. So this is a resource that if you're really kind of thinking about how do we engage parent leaders in our district, this might be a resource to turn to. And then finally, pass it back to Danielle.
And so we also developed at Metro Center a culturally responsive curriculum scorecard. So there's been a lot of talk throughout the presentation today, and even in my group, about developing curriculum that's culturally responsive and sustaining. So this scorecard can help parents, teachers, and administrators, students, and community members determine the extent to which their schools science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics curriculum are or are not culturally responsive. And the way that the scorecard works is provoking thinking about what students should learn, how they should learn it, and why they should learn it, and how curriculum can be transformed to engage students effectively. So the links for all of these resources are in the document that Judy shared, and the scorecard can be downloaded and used by anyone to kind of grade, quote unquote, their school's curriculum.
Great. And lastly, just a few more resources if you're interested. One is from some colleagues at the University of Washington who have developed great tools around co-design with families. Another with some colleagues in Texas from the Intercultural Development Research Association, or IDRA, on education cafes, which are parent leadership groups like PTAs, but they're not located in schools or located in community spaces. And then a more intensive guide for culturally responsive and sustaining family engagement. So we hope you keep in touch with us. We're so grateful to the Friday Cafe hosts for inviting us here today. Thank you. We're so grateful for all of you for being here despite your very busy schedules. And we would love to be in touch if you have any questions or if there's any other ways that we can support you in your work. And I'll turn it back over to Judy or Betsy for any last words.
So Judy, I've already talked. It's your turn if you wanted to talk and say some last words.
We're very equitable about taking turns. We are. I just want to appreciate Joanna and Danielle for everything you've given us this morning. I feel like I've gotten a big basket of gifts, and I just want to dig in, and I want to spend a week with you too, just soaking it all up. This was really, really a very special and meaningful presentation, and the timing is really important for schools and for families. And so we will be working with your tools, and I'm sure you'll be hearing much more from Connecticut. So I want to thank you. I know you're very busy as well. We really appreciate you being here. And with that, I think we're adjourned, and we really hope to see everybody back in 2 weeks, June 4th. We're going to be talking about social emotional learning and a strengths-based approach. I think it's going to follow on very nicely from what we did today. So thank you, everybody. Take care. Be well. We'll see you next time.